Hi, my name is Emily Johnson. I am a history student at ETSU, and today I will be talking about Anne, Queen of what would become Great Britain. Anne was born in 1665 to James Stuart, Duke of York, and his first wife, Anne Hyde. Her uncle was King Charles II, who was the son of the deposed King Charles I. Anne was the second surviving daughter to her parents, her sister Mary being the first. And therefore, it was not expected for her to become a ruler. While James was a staunch Catholic, Charles was Protestant and insisted that Mary and Anne be raised as Protestant as well. There was a growing fear of a Catholic ruler in England, as Mary I was the last Catholic monarch, and people feared another who would force conversion. It was briefly considered that she would marry George of Hanover, but for whatever reason, she ended up marrying George of Denmark. And this made her not only Princess of England because she was the granddaughter of a monarch and then subsequently a niece of a monarch, but she was also Princess of Denmark. And while the match was originally a political one, George and Anne would grow to love each other dearly. And Anne would get pregnant 17 times, but only one son would survive infancy in 1689. Her son would be named William, and he would be made Duke of Gloucester. Unfortunately, little William would pass away in 1700 at the age of 11 as well. His death would cause Parliament to pass the Acts of Settlement in 1701 that would ensure that the throne would go to Anne's Hanoverian cousins after her death, as they too were Protestant. Unfortunately, George would pass away in 1708, and Anne would mourn him deeply. Anne had two favorites, or what we would now call best friends. Sarah Churchill, formerly Sarah Jennings, was a childhood best friend who, according to historic royal palaces, came to court to be a lady in waiting to Mary of Modena, who was the second wife of King James II. Anne and Sarah would follow the example set by older sister Mary and her childhood friend in writing letters to one another using pseudonyms. Anne would be Mrs. Morley, and Sarah would be Mrs. Freeman. And of course, their husbands were also Mr. Morley and Mr. Freeman. And they would even use these nicknames in person, mostly in private settings when they were just chit-chatting away from the eyes of court, well, as far from the eyes of court as you can get. Sarah and her husband would become Duke and Duchess of Marlborough under Anne's rule, among other titles, and this is because of loyalty. And the Duke of Marlborough was actually a soldier in Prince George's military, as well as James II's military. Now, the problem with Sarah being so close to the Queen was that the power went straight to her head. She became very controlling over Anne and tried to tell her how to run her government. This would lead to many fights over the years, and sometimes right in front of the court, and sometimes what was supposed to be private, but we could hear outside of the private rooms. Now, the final fight was arguably the worst, and it took place at Anne's official residence in Kensington Palace in 1710. During this fight, Sarah would continue to argue and fling insults and try to contain control, but Anne would only respond by telling her that if she had anything to say, she could put it in writing, and this is according to historic royal palaces. Afterwards, Sarah would go on to spread vicious rumors about the Queen and her new friend, Abigail. Abigail was a cousin to Sarah, Abigail's father had fallen on to hard times and subsequently died. So Sarah took her in and got her a position at court, trying to help her. That way she had some kind of income and potentially could be seen as a good person for helping out a family member. Abigail ended up rising the proverbial ladder to become the new favorite of the queen, as Anne had already before this funded and attended, secretly I might add, the wedding of Abigail and a servant of Prince George of Denmark's. Now, according to History.com, Abigail would become keeper of the privy purse, and her husband would become a baron. They both would outlive the queen. Abigail, once the queen died, would actually be accused of stealing the queen's jewels after her death, but Sarah would vouch for her, saying, and I quote, "I believe the Lady Masham never robbed anybody but me," end quote, from History.com. King Charles II would pass away in 1685, and there were rumors that he converted to Catholicism on his deathbed, but I haven't found any proof of that. Anne's father, as previously mentioned, became King James II. He and his wife Mary had not had children up to this point, but did have multiple failed pregnancies, unfortunately. According to Royal Collection Trust, Mary and James II would push for the conversion of the English people to Catholicism. The idea was very unpopular, but it was tolerated at first because his children were absolutely Anglican. But then James and Mary had a son in 1688 named James Francis Edward Stuart. Now, this alarmed Parliament because now there would be a potential second Catholic monarch in a row. And maybe that monarch might also push for the state religion to become Catholicism. They absolutely did not want this. They absolutely wanted to remain Catholic. Sure, there were probably a few that were okay with this, as they were probably still Catholics themselves. But the overwhelming majority wanted Protestantism. Now, Anne did not help this situation when she helped spread rumors that Queen Mary's pregnancy was a false one, and then spread rumors that the baby who was born was actually the warming pan baby. Now, this theory, rumor, whatever you call it, stated that the baby was not the child of the king and queen, but a commoner baby that was snuck in through the warming pan that was used to keep the bed and the person sleeping in it warm. In an almost bloodless revolution, Mary and William were invited to come from the Netherlands, primarily Orange, to rule England, and they would do so as joint rulers. King James, Queen Mary, Prince James would flee to France, as King James had done so with his family during the previous revolution when they overthrew his father, Charles I. James and his son would be a thorn in the English monarch's side for years to come. Now, because William and Mary, who, by the way, are the namesakes for the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia, were joint rulers, both had to pass away before Anne could rule. Now, Mary would die in 1694, while William would live until 1702. Neither sister would have any heirs of their own. And due to her illnesses and disabilities, it was thought that Anne would be inept at ruling the country, but she would go on to prove everyone wrong. She would regularly meet with advisors, and the BBC explained, and I quote, "Politically, Anne's reign was marked by the development of the two-party system, with Whigs and Tories competing for power. Anne had hoped to rule through mixed ministries, but in 1708 the Whigs became dominant. In 1710 there was a major shift to the Tories, which lasted until her death. Anne allowed herself to be heavily influenced by her ministers and her favorites, particularly her friend Sarah Churchill, wife of the Duke of Marlborough. End quote. Now, her reign would also be marked by the Acts of Union. To better understand the historical importance of the Acts of Union in 1707, we have to look at the steps taken over the centuries to get to that point. In 1282, England annexed Wales under the rule of Edward I. In 1284, the Statute of Rhuddlan officially incorporated Wales into England. Edward I then made his son and heir, Prince of Wales, and the title has been used ever since to signify the heir to the English throne. Wales would become legally a part of England under the Laws of Wales Act in 1534 to 1542. Henry VIII wished to give the Welsh the same rights as the English in 1534, but it wouldn't fully happen until 1542 with another act of the same name. And at this time, Wales could finally be able to send representatives to Parliament in England. During all of this, England and Scotland would still be separate countries who were ruled by different people. Now, in 1603, Queen Elizabeth I of England would die without any heirs. So King James of Scotland would inherit the throne, and thus becoming both King James VI of Scotland and the First of England. Now, the two countries would not be united until 1707, even though they were ruled by the same person. The Acts of Union in 1707 would actually finally combine these two countries. Now, another Act of Union would occur in 1801 that would join Ireland to the Union until about 1922, thus creating what was called Great Britain and Ireland as one entity. Queen Anne supported the unification of Scotland and England, not Ireland, I'm sorry, in 1707 under the Acts of Union in that year. Before said union, Scotland didn't have to agree to or accept Anne's successor, George of Hanover. But due to fear of Anne's very Catholic half-brother coming back to claim the Scottish throne, they agreed to do so. In a quote from Britannica, unification posed an answer for both kingdoms' problems. Free and equal trade throughout the new unified kingdom would be Scotland's payoff, and in return, England would get Scotland's acquiescence to the Hanoverian succession, through which Protestant rule would be maintained by the accession to the throne of George I. Scotland had to relinquish its parliament under the agreement, but it kept its Scottish law. Thus, the 1707 Act of Union, which went into effect May 1st, 1707, creating the Kingdom of Great Britain, was a winning deal on both sides of the border. End quote. Great Britain and the United Kingdom are commonly mistaken for the same thing, but they are not the same thing. According to Britannica, Great Britain refers to the island unification of Scotland and England. That's it. Whereas the United Kingdom are all the individual countries in the kingdom of, England. In conclusion, in 1714, Anne suffered multiple strokes in one day. While doctors did try to save her life, the methods that they used were very painful and they did not help at all. Medicine being what it was back then, they didn't know that they were probably making the situation worse. The following day, Parliament sent for George of Hanover, who would become King George I of Britain. His family held the throne until the death of Queen Victoria in 1901, at which point they were the House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha until World War I. Thank you.